Most people don't even think about a choke point until one comes under threat. The Strait of Hormuz, the Strait of Malacca, the Taiwan Strait. Narrow passages where a disruption lasting days can trigger consequences that last months. In today's world, power is no longer measured only by military strength. It's increasingly measured by control, access, and dependence. And few places sit closer to the center of those forces than Taiwan. 3 questions we'll be asking today. What makes a choke point dangerous? Why has Taiwan become central to global competition? How does dependence create both leverage and vulnerability? The war between the US and Iran has put one strategic waterway at the center of global attention, the Strait of Hormuz. About 1/5 of the world oil flows through the strait, making it one of the world's most critical choke points. At one point, US President Donald Trump even floated the idea of charging vessels a 20% transit fee, arguing that America's role as guardian angel should not come for free.
We're going to keep the strait, and we'll probably run it. We'll become the guardian of the strait. Maybe we'll call it the guardian angel of the strait, and we should be reimbursed for that.
More than 6,000 kilometers away, another strategic choke point is drawing global attention. Beijing has been expanding grey zone operations from the South China Sea to the Taiwan Strait, increasing pressure along the first island chain and reminding the world that control over key shipping routes remains a powerful geopolitical tool.
呼叫中国海警14605，呼叫中国海警14605，这里是中华民国海巡署 PP1东3空警广播。你未经许可进入我国水域，已违反国际法规定。
The Strait of Hormuz and the Taiwan Strait may seem very different, but both illustrate that a disruption in a single strategic corridor can have far-reaching consequences. Whether moving energy, goods, or technology, modern economies depend on a few critical connections. For decades, globalization was built on efficiency and interdependence. But as geopolitical competition heats up, the connections that have driven growth are increasingly seen as sources of leverage and vulnerability. I'm Laurel Stewart. This is The Chainmaker. Joining us in the studio today is Professor Roger Liu of National Sun Yat-sen University, and from Taichung, Professor Jabin T. Jacob, visiting scholar at National Hsing University. Welcome, both of you, to the show.
Nice to be here.
Nice to be here.
So we've just talked about strategic waterways and growing geopolitical pressure. Roger, I'd like to start with you. Many policymakers now see economic interdependence as a source of vulnerability. Why is that?
Well, when this idea first started to take place, actually it's a guarantee for peace, because when Joseph Nye, a famous professor at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, interdependence actually indicates that when great powers, when they're doing business with each other, when they're collaborating on different kinds of international share common topics, actually that will help to regain peace because, well, they are interdependent to each other. But the reality now is that, well, scholars like Farrell and Newman in the year of 2019 found that, well, interdependence actually is not equal. So there are some rule makers in the system which gain more power than others. And there is a tendency for the great powers to use the advantage that they have in the network as a hub to press others to accept their political needs. So that being said, it's hard to separate business and international politics for now. For example, the US has been writing the rules for the world banking for the past few decades. So now when it wants to start its rival from gaining the funding from different resources, they can do it through a SWIFT system. The same happens in the semiconductor realm. So some semiconductor companies like NVIDIA and Micron actually has more power than others, and they are US companies. And some manufacturing companies like TSMC actually controls 90% of the world advanced semiconductor fabrications. So if these companies and behind them, the countries that controls those companies wants to stop their rivals from getting what they want, they can do that. So under this weaponized scenario, actually it makes everything harder.
I'd like to just bring Jabin in on this and bring it back a bit to the geopolitical context. How has the definition of a choke point changed and evolved with globalization?
Well, I think some things remain the same. Products are still largely carried by shipping. So geography matters, physical choke points matter, and I think what we are seeing in the Gulf of Hormuz is exactly that. Globalization might have evolved, but what I think has evolved is, as Roger pointed out, choke points are also no longer geographic. Countries, companies, they can all serve in their own ways as choke points. I mean, you look at how China's imposed export controls, for example, that's a choke point. And the threat against small countries like Taiwan also is potentially a choke point.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned export controls there as a new form of choke point. Roger, bringing in the kind of virtual, but also the geographical choke points, which ones are worrying governments most today?
Well, I would like to echo what Jabin has indicated. Well, if we have two choke points plus together, for example, a place that is at the same time the physical choke point and also the technical choke point as well, well, this place will become more important than others. For example, the Taiwan Strait, the Hormuz Strait is also the same. Malacca Strait is almost the same because these places not only serve as a geographic choke point, but also they're controlling the what we call the strategic materials. For example, for Hormuz Strait is oil, petroleum. For Taiwan, actually, Taiwan has the most comprehensive semiconductor ecological system in the world. And the TSMC, one company is making 90% of the advanced chips for the world. So if anything happens on Taiwan, actually it will cut a lot of things.
Yeah. I mean, as you just mentioned, energy and goods move through most choke points, but none shape both the physical and digital economies quite like Taiwan. The Taiwan Strait remains a vital shipping corridor, while Taiwan's semiconductor industry powers everything from AI to advanced defense systems. Now, let's talk a bit about the cost of a Taiwan Strait crisis. Bloomberg Economics has estimated that war in the Taiwan Strait could cost the global economy $10 trillion in just 1 year. I mean, the potential costs are enormous. Does that make Taiwan a systemic risk, or does that actually form a deterrence?
Look, Taiwan is part of a larger global economic system, and it affects and is affected in turn by whatever goes on around it. So at the moment, as you said, the world's dependence on Taiwan for advanced semiconductor chips is at an unprecedented level. However, this can work both ways. You're right in that this is a form of deterrence that works in Taiwan's advantage. It's not enough for one country to simply threaten, and others will not simply wait and watch. Everybody's interested in Taiwan's fate. However, this is where I suppose old-fashioned politics comes in. It's not often purely rational economic choices that drive conflict. It's the political, it's the cultural, it's ideological. So there can be other factors that come in. I mean, Taiwan's deterrence through semiconductor chips works until it doesn't. So I think Taiwanese the Taiwanese government, the Taiwanese people, as well as other countries watching the situation have to be alert to the possibility that there can be other factors that impact Taiwan's security and stability.
Roger, I'd like to get your take on this as well. Taiwan's semiconductor industry risk or deterrence?
If people like to use the word silicon shield to mention this, however, it can be two things because there's also a broken nest theory. For silicon shield, I would like to say that, well, Taiwan has the silicon, but the US has the shield. So Taiwan silicon has to be important enough for the US come for rescue if China decided to do anything regarding Taiwan, especially to take away its shield manufacturing capability. Well, military speaking, we have, because, well, the TSMC is not only making chips for their commercial partners, but also for their military partners like the US Air Force. You can find it in the best weapons like F-35. So in this case, actually, US needs Taiwan. However, well, Taiwan is so close to China, so China can actually by kidnapping that, China can control the resource or the source of the most important chips by a click of its finger. So that actually creates a dilemma for the US. So now what they are doing is to de-risk that. By relocating some part, at least the most important parts of the capacity back in the US, they can actually hedge in this kind of risk. But it depends on many things. Maybe we will be talking about this later.
Well, I mean, I'm glad that you brought that up about the silicon shield and this idea of the US de-risking. In Taiwan, many people have called that a hollowing out of Taiwan's chip industry and actually reducing the power that their so-called silicon shield has. Jabin, what's your take on this?
So, you know, the ultimate deterrence is actually weapons, physical, conventional weapons. And over time, actually, I mean, quite apart from the sort of weapons part of it, you know, look at the other aspects. I would say that over time, Taiwan has actually run down its own deterrence capabilities. I mean, it shut down nuclear power production on the island, for example. So in a sense, it is now entirely dependent on hydrocarbons shipped by sea and therefore created another layer of vulnerability or choke point around Taiwan, right? And to sort of carry on from what Roger said, I mean, diversification is all to the good. But the fact is that the Chinese are also diversifying. The Chinese are also increasing their, capacities for semiconductor production, etc. And so, in that sense, if the Chinese have other alternatives, then the risks of targeting Taiwan are that much lesser for China. And as Roger pointed out, then the interest in that the Americans have in coming to Taiwan's defense is also reduced. I think in the long run, Taiwan will have to do more than just rely on the silicon shield. I mean, it'll have to up its diplomatic game. So its foreign policy needs to evolve in order to raise the stakes and interests in Taiwan.
So the sense that actually Taiwan needs to diversify its strengths away from the silicon shield into other forms of diplomacy as well.
Yeah.
The cost of a Taiwan crisis would not just be financial. It would reshape who leads in technology, who sets the rules in the region, and how power is perceived across the Indo-Pacific. If Taiwan's semiconductor ecosystem were disrupted, Roger, what would it mean for the future of AI?
Well, now the US and China has been competing on AI front. So Taiwan actually is the most important player in the US camp. So if you check the composition of the AI shelf, for example, the shelves that NVIDIA has been making, you will see that 80 to 90% of the components come from different Taiwanese companies. Only HBM or high-band memories are from the Korean companies or the US company Micron. Even Micron has outsourced its Taiwan to its Taiwan makers. So if the rival of the U.S. doesn't need to totally destroy Taiwan, they just need to impose some kind of tactics such as quarantine or blockade, which can stop Taiwan or to bring into halt for Taiwan to function as the AI producing machine. That will actually stop the advancement or the progress of the U.S. So Taiwan in this place plays a very important role. The U.S. has to protect or at least to ensure that in any case, this powerhouse can keep moving.
I mean, you mentioned that South Korean technology is that much further behind. Would South Korea, Japan step in that case?
Well, in the current situation, everything is possible, but it will not happen very quickly because in Japan, they are still lacking the manufacturing of the up-to-date or what they call the next generation semiconductors. And in Korea, they have been focusing upon the making of memories. And what's worse is that 35 to 40% of either Samsung or SK Hynix, the manufacturing capacity lies in their China factories. So if that happens, actually, there will be, so far, no country can actually outpace Taiwan on this part.
Jabin, beyond technology, what would a fundamental change in Taiwan's status actually mean for the whole region?
I think that would be the end of American credibility and prestige. I mean, that would be the end of American alliances, the international order as we know it, because the impact would be not just physical or political, but economic, as well as, in a sense, in many ways, ideological, because it would mean that one model, the liberal democratic model of international relations or even internal politics, has given way to power and efficiency of an authoritarian system. So it will be the end of what we call Pax Americana and the beginning of a Chinese world order, Chinese-led world order.
Taiwan's future is not shaped by Washington and Beijing alone. Taiwan is also a vibrant democracy that seeks to determine its own fate. However, other Indo-Pacific powers are also becoming stakeholders in regional stability. Roger, are Indo-Pacific countries forming their own coordinated response to China? I mean, we've seen Japan deploying troops in this year's Balikatan drills, which is joint Philippine-US drills for the first time this year. How are they developing a regional cooperation?
Well, if you're talking about what is called the Quad countries, which are India, Japan, Australia, and the US, they are actually upend the defense of this region. However, for some other countries like the ones in the continental Southeast Asia, actually there is a tendency to hedge. But whatever happens, people are actually trying to increase the collective security levels in this region, especially with the U.S. help. The multilateral security regime actually has been strengthened, especially through the rise of emerging technology, because this actually is what connects U.S., Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, and other countries. We all know that emerging technology has the dual-use nature. So that means that countries can benefit from the rise of or the development of or the research and development of the emerging technology economically, but they can also increase their security levels through the developing or obtaining of emerging technologies. So now, under this scenario, I think the collaboration among the East Asian or Asian Pacific countries has become closer.
So with these emerging technologies, what kind of alliances are being built?
Well, there are different attempts. For example, there was a Chip 4 initiative combining US, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. However, it's not working very successfully because, the competitions between different countries on their firms. However, U.S. actually has been talking about this. For example, recently they formed a Pax Silica, which means peace through silicon. So a lot of countries, including the ones in this region and outside of this region, has been brought in, and Taiwan has also been, although not a signatory, but Taiwan is a very important participant, observer, protected by the U.S. So this, like what we have mentioned, security through emerging technologies actually has been increased.
So moving away from the Indo-Pacific, if we look at South Asia, India is increasingly viewed as a key balancing power. Jabin, how does New Delhi view Taipei, and how would India potentially play a role in the regional order?
Look, I mean, India is a big country. It has a lot of priorities, and Taiwan, I wouldn't say is at the top. But the Taiwanese have done several smart things over the years. They have diversified their investments in India. We've had some very big deals on semiconductor fabs, etc., come up in recent years. Taiwanese investments also are diversified geographically. However, for India to also view or take Taiwanese views on board consistently and more seriously, I think there needs to be a greater diversity also in the number of exchanges and the kinds of exchanges that we have. Right now, these exchanges are rather heavily at the top, the elite level, or only at the technology level. But, a lot of Indians, of course, come to Taiwan to study, to work here, etc. But what is the reverse flow of population? How many Taiwanese actually go to India to live, to work, to study? How many Taiwanese? Roger is an exception in the sense that Roger spent over a decade in India. But we need a heck of a lot more Rogers from Taiwan to do this.
Does that need to come from the Taiwanese side?
I think for now, it needs to come from the Taiwanese side, because really the Taiwanese, in that sense, need India to play a much more active role. But India has its own dynamics in its relationship with China, and so Taiwan sort of gets put to the side, except in the technology realm. But we need much more than technology. We need to have a political conversation. We need to be able to have a conversation at the level of educational institutions, exchanges, people-to-people ties, even Buddhist religious tourism. All of this really needs to be scaled up. And that's when we have a complex interdependence, as international relations theorists would say.
Professor Liu and Professor Jacob, thank you so much for both joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Today's discussion highlights a central paradox. The more connected Taiwan becomes, the more pressure it faces. And in a world shaped by competition over technology, supply chains, and geography, resilience may matter now more than ever. We'll be back after the break with the Supply Chain Index. Now let's take a look at tech biz. First up, AI is getting expensive. As companies ramp up their use of generative AI, costs are rising quickly. Some businesses are now scaling back deployments and putting a stronger focus on managing AI spending. Next, a major milestone for India's private space industry. Skyroot Aerospace has successfully launched its Vikram 1 rocket, a breakthrough that could help accelerate the country's growing commercial space sector. And finally, Taiwan's outbound investment continues to gain momentum. Overseas investment has surged nearly 58% over the past 5 years, as companies expand beyond China and invest more heavily in the United States and Southeast Asia. That's all for today's Tech Biz. August marks 34 years since South Korea cut diplomatic ties with Taiwan. But while official relations ended, economic competition never did. Back in the late 1990s, scholars coined the term Jakota to describe Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, three export-driven economies that became the manufacturing backbone of globalization. Although Taiwan's economy remains smaller than those of Japan and South Korea, it now produces nearly 90% of the world's advanced semiconductor chips. As AI demand surges, Taiwan's economy is projected to outpace both South Korea and Japan this year. Taiwan's exports jumped more than 30% last year to a record $640 billion, While Japan and South Korea also benefit from AI demand, Taiwan's chip industry has captured the largest share of the boom. The impact is also showing up in income. Taiwan's GDP per capita has already surpassed South Korea's and is expected to exceed $40,000 this year. By the early 2030s, the gap could widen even further. For years, South Korea was seen as Taiwan's toughest technology rival. But AI is changing that relationship. Competition remains intense, but interconnected chip supply chains are creating new incentives for cooperation. So AI is not only reshaping the global economy, it may also be redefining East Asia's economic hierarchy, with Taiwan pulling more weight. Chokepoints are no longer just narrow waterways. They are critical networks, technologies, and supply chains that underpin the modern economy. Understanding them means understanding power in today's world. Thank you for watching The Chainmaker. I'm Laurel Stewart. See you next time.